Hey, what's up, YouTube fans? So the topic for this video, right, is the evolutionary reducibility of tetrapod limbs and origin of them from fish fins, right? So we see, right, that whales and seals, they have limbs with the same fundamental structure as other tetrapods, and yet used as fins, right? Much like how a fish uses its fins, right? But sharing the same structure, right? As in your arms and hands, right? With humerus, radius, ulna, carpals, metacarpals, and digits with phalanges, right? All within a fin, right? And so aside from the progression of the limbs from early tetrapods to our arms and hands that we now have, right? I've made other videos on that. I've talked about how, the origin of arms and hands in primates, right, was from modification of what was the front legs and feet in earlier creatures, right? It's the same, our arms and hands is the same fundamental structure as a dog's front legs and feet, right? Even though it's functionally used very different, and we see that there are creatures that use their legs and feet for climbing, right? Even which have 4 legs and feet, right? Like cats, right? And so the evolution of arms and hands can come from gradual modification of what was legs and feet, right? And, in mammals, we get the evolution of more vertically positioned legs, right? So the legs more positioned under the body, whereas before that, more like in lizards and salamanders, right, where they have more horizontally positioned legs and almost crawling across the ground, right? And in early tetrapods, right, like we see commonly in amphibians, they were using their limbs both for terrestrial movements, so walking on land, but also for swimming, right? The same limbs, right, can be used for both purposes. We see this commonly in amphibians, right? And likely also having webbing of the toes, right? We see this commonly in a lot of amphibians, right, where there's webbing between their toes, right? So rather than having like space between their fingers and or toes, right, like we do, it's filled in with skin and muscle between each of them, right? And that can be the setup of the earliest tetrapod limbs, right? The earliest tetrapod toes, right? To have it like that, right? But so with to even get like limbs like that of amphibians, like we see in early tetrapods, right? There's reducibility of that back to limbs that were more like a fin, right? So we see in whales, right? Whales and dolphins technically are whales. We see in them, right, that it's the same fundamental limb structure, right? Even having carpals and metacarpals and digits with phalanges, right? But all within a fin, right? And we also have fossil creatures, early tetrapodomorphs, which show that all of these bones first showed up in fins, right? And so it can be useful to have, that same fundamental skeletal structure, all of those bones, and functioning, as what we would call a limb, but still also functioning as a fin and having a shape, more characteristic of a fin, and functionally being used that way, functionally, you know, being used in the water as well as moving on land, right? And so to get all of the bones of the tetrapod limbs, right, that can start before it is no longer fins. It can start in fins that are also limbs, right, like we see in the whales, right? And further supporting this, right, so the closest living relatives of tetrapods are lungfish and coelacanths. They still are they still lack enough of the tetrapod features and possess enough of the common fish features that we would consider them fish, but they're more closely related to humans and other tetrapods than they are to other fish, the lungfish and coelacanths, right, than they are to other living fish, right? That is indicated both by genetic evidence and anatomical evidence, right? But so in the lungfish and the coelacanths, they have 4 limbs which are also fins, and in the case of lungfish, because they not only have limbs but they also have lungs, they can move around on land and spend significant amount of time on land, right? And yet their limbs lack features of the tetrapod limbs, even features found in whale limbs. So even though a whale has limbs, there are also fins, but a whale has carpals and metacarpals and digits with phalanges, right? Whereas in the limbs of lungfish and coelacanths, they have the beginning of the bone pattern of the tetrapod limb. They have 1 big bone followed by 2 smaller bones, but then they don't have the other bones after that, right? And yet, in spite of not only having their limbs also be fins and having their limbs lacking somewhat, you know, the rest of the tetrapod limbs, right? They don't have carpals or metacarpals or tarsals or metatarsals or digits with phalanges, right? They don't have any of that, and yet the lungfish can still move around on land successfully and spend significant amount of time on land, right? So that shows the reducibility of it then, right? That it does not need to be as advanced as a tetrapod limb is to work at all. It does not have to come about all at once in a single step. And there are adaptive advantages to a species that already goes on land spending more time on land. It could help with avoiding predators in the water. It could help with accessing resources on the land, such as food, right? And so in tetrapod ancestors, right, what was their limbs were gradually adapted towards moving on land more and more, right? And we see the limbs first starting in appendages that were also fins, right? And so that further shows the reducibility of it, right? Because bony fins are useful even if they're not functioning as limbs, right? So there are other fish, other bony fin fish, the ray fin fish, they have bony fins, right? But their fins are not limbs, right? And so the muscles that move the fins are at the base of the fin, not within the fin, like in lungfish and coelacanths. And they do not have that bone pattern at the beginning of the tetrapod limb. They do not have 1 bone followed by 2 smaller bones. They do not have that bone pattern, and yet it is still useful for them to have fins, right? And so then that shows the reducibility of it even further. And some of the ray fin fish can move on land to some extent, right? Some catfish, for example, can move on land for short stretches, right? And so that setup in of itself allows some amount of land movement, at least for some of them, right? And so that all the more shows the reducibility of the appendage, that bony fins can be useful even before their fins, or even before their limbs, right? the appendages that would eventually be our limbs, right? And we see in some creatures like the chondrichthyes, like sharks, and in the jawless fish, we see that they have cartilaginous fins, no bone, and that still in of itself works, right? And the fins can, obviously become, more and more efficient towards swimming. And originally, there doesn't even need to be fins. There are creatures like flatworms that can swim around with no limbs, fins, none of that. And so all the more shows the reducibility of our limbs, that they did not have to come about in a single step. They can be broken down into a long series of progressive steps, each useful in its own way, each giving adaptive advantage. All right, that's all for now. See you guys.